I'll say that's 85% correct. But I'll sum it up even simpler. Government cannot afford affordable housing.
Chris Seepe, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing good. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, listen, it's great to have you here. It's been a while since we've seen each other with the new world that we live in today. And I wanted to have you on this call today because I consider you, I don't know if you know this or not, but I consider you a mentor. Darlene and I, Darlene and I attended your course. I think it's probably one of the best multifamily courses out there. And we took a lot of notes. We learned a lot about it. And here's what I liked about your course, right? Is that it wasn't a hard sell. It was like, you're either going to like this or want to get into it, or you're going to decide that you're not going to. And that's what
I've had two people who took the course. I've taught hundreds, but I've had two people who came up after the course was over. They said they loved the course. It was money well spent, and they will never become a landlord.
But that's what you want, though. You want them to know the truth. Decision. For sure.
Yeah.
Right. Here's the good side of real estate investing, and here's the not so good side of real estate investing. You choose.
Very much so.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So listen, there's a lot of things happening in the world today. I want to dive into it, but first, I want people to know who you are, why you got into real estate investing, and then we'll open up the can of worms.
Well, I'm not sure why I got into real estate investing now, but I know what you're asking. Yeah. So you want a 30-second introduction?
Sure.
All right. So I'm the president of Landlords Association for Durham Region. I own 7 buildings comprising 71 units at the moment. I just sold the building a little while ago. I had 80-something units. I'm an outspoken advocate for affordable housing, or unaffordable housing, frankly, because affordable housing always sounds like social housing, and that's not what we're talking about here. I got into becoming a real estate investor 12 years ago after a 35-year career in information technology, because I realized I wouldn't be able to retire, or at least retire into the lifestyle that I would like to become accustomed to. Not the one that I had, the one I want, travel the world and not worry about the cost of things.
Right.
And I spent a lot of time, probably 6 months, trying to figure out, okay, if I'm not going to be in that business anymore, what business should I be in? And I finally, clicked into real estate. I always thought the industry, and I still think the industry crawls on its stomach. I think the vast majority of the people that partake in this business shouldn't be in this business for one reason or another. Nevertheless, for the first time ever, I'd always heard about opium or OPM or other people's money. And for the first time ever, it registered with me. I can put in $25 to own 100% of an investment property, and I can borrow the rest of the money, fix it up, improve it, and then refinance and get my money out. So it made sense. And over the course of 12 years, I bought 7, more than 7. But currently I have 7, and as a real estate broker of record, I specialize only in this business, and I've helped lots of other people, buy and sell their properties.
Right.
That's a short.
Thanks for that. Now, we obviously live in some different times today, and I think I want to dig into the fact that you also came to the realization that you weren't going to live the life that you wanted to live. Was it because of inflation? What was it that you actually saw?
No, not at that time. It wasn't inflation. It was, I'd socked away some money, but what do I invest in? I don't know anything about stocks. Bonds are, very poor return on investment. They may be safe, but, you're not going to be able to live off of them unless you got millions of dollars in bonds. Cryptocurrency would seem like an extension of my IT background, but I think it's still the Wild West. There's been over 75 major fraud situations involving exchanges. Do I want to start another business? No, been there, done that. was successful in one case, unsuccessful in 3 cases. And no matter how I looked at it, I had no comfort that that I would have a recurring income stream that I could rely upon without being stressed out. And here we are going to hyperinflation, which will soon hit double digits. I talked about this more than 2 years ago. Everyone told me I was full of beans. So I made plans for it. And now the question is, what do you invest in? Because there are very, very few things that track with inflation. Tell me what things you can think of that you could invest in, that no matter what happens with the dollar value, your investment will grow with it or track with it.
The only thing I can think of, Chris, is real estate. Something hard, tangible, gold, silver. That's another thing.
Gold and silver don't track well, right? Everyone said that you should buy gold and silver. The problem I have with that is that it's not recurring revenue. If it does go through the roof, then you sell it. Now what do you do with that money? You put
it's
it
more
into
of
the
an
bank?
insurance play. Yeah, that's the way that I kind of look at it. It's more of an insurance play, if anything else.
Well, it's a backup if everything else collapses, I would say.
Right.
But in terms of retirement income, it doesn't make sense to me. But the other things that I thought about are what tracks. Well, utility companies. Most of them have a moat, if you will, or Warren Buffett says, buy investments that have a moat. In other words, a protected territory. So utility companies have that. Railroad companies have that. Banks grew astronomically. The insurance companies are royally socking it to everyone, with anywhere from 25 to 400% increase in premiums over the last year, and they're having the best, most profitable years of their lives. So if you can't beat them, maybe get dividends from them at the back end. And the last thing I think of is grocery stores. Food is always going to track, the cost of food tracks with the cost of inflation. I can remember seeing a documentary in Germany where a loaf of bread, in 1921 cost, a mark, 2 marks, whatever they called it. And during the inflationary period, it was like, 100,000 marks for a loaf of bread.
Right.
Inflation gone rampant.
And you know what? You don't even have to even go that far back. I mean, you could take a look at Yugoslavia, right? You can go take a look at Zimbabwe.
Or look at any of the countries that were invaded, Iraq and the African nations that are suffering, or Argentina, which is an oil-based economy that absolutely devastated itself with its misguided investment policies, by government. So it's everywhere. Or 1980 to 1990 with the Americans. Americans who left the money in the bank, I read, lost 50% of the total value over a period of a decade because of inflation.
Right. And so you just touched on something that I want to dig into there, which is, let's go a little bit back into history in the 70s, and we'll kind of come up to where we are today, but more on affordable housing. Like, why are we where we are today? Like, what's happening? And then I know you've also talked about some solutions. So let's talk about the problem, and let's talk about what we can maybe potentially do to cause or to fix some of this. Because I take a look at I like to help investors, but I also see what's happening on the tenant side as well too. And I really feel for these families because, I had a tenant that went vacant a year ago. They were there and they were paying $2,000. This year now I can probably get $2,500 for it. And this is a serious problem. So maybe just kind of walk us through some of that.
Well, I spend an hour and a half just discussing that topic, and I prefer to call it the unaffordable housing crisis, because everyone talks about it as affordable housing. What they're really talking about it gets confused all the time with social housing or public housing. I want housing that's affordable and, the government should pay for and that type of thing. And I don't think that's what most people mean when they're talking about housing affordability. Someone who's making $150,000 a year 10 years ago could have bought a $600,000 home. Well, today, even if you're making $200,000 a year, you can't buy a $1 million home because there aren't any. right? The average home in Toronto is $1.2 million now, recently reported. So it's a question of affordability all the way up and down, let's call it the food chain. So the people at the top end can't move out of their rental places because they can't have a place that they can afford to purchase, who normally would vacate, and then everybody else percolates up, if you will. And, the low end get in at the low end, or the low wage earners get in at the low end of the rental market, and everybody else moves up the chain. But that was also compounded by the government's, I'll call it short-sighted, maybe even fatally flawed policy of the stress test. Now, it appeared that the stress test was a good thing in the beginning. It actually did calm the market for a short time. And for those that don't know what a stress test is, it's, in its simplest terms, is you have to qualify for a mortgage at 2% above whatever the interest rate is that that the banks are offering. It's a little more involved than that, but that's the simple version.
Right.
The net effect of that stress test is that it locked out 200,000 Canadian families. And where are they all living? In rental properties. So if those 200,000 people in rental properties aren't moving out, and the people who historically would be entering the market at the low end, which could be students, immigrants, refugees, seniors who are downsizing or want to save their money and move into a rental property and so on, all of these people got locked out, 200,000 at least.
Right. And he used this broad brush for the whole entire country as well, too.
Yeah. It's the same everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the worst areas or the most heavily impacted areas are British Columbia, Vancouver, Greater Vancouver area, and Toronto, of course. They're the ones that we talk about all the time. But it's no coincidence that the same provinces who are suffering from housing unavailability are also the ones that are most heavily socialist. There's such a heavy regulated tenant bias legislation in these two provinces that nobody wants to build here, or it's just too difficult, or it's too expensive to build here. But the issue of housing availability is worldwide. It's not, it's not just Toronto, Canada, Ontario. It's everywhere. I mean, it doesn't matter where you go. Australia, I've read stuff on Australia. I've read stuff about Germany. I've been in the UK. I know what's going on there. And it is a global issue. And I would say it's almost pandemic.
I was
just going to say, I wanted to answer your question, Gary. Sure, what's causing this? Yeah. And I spent an hour and a half about that. And if you don't mind, I'll reference and say I've got two presentations I've done on YouTube. So if you take my last name, it's Seepe, and the word unaffordable, a couple will pop up, and I talk at length about what I think the issues are. But I'll sum it up here in less than a minute. The overarching issue of unaffordability, the vast majority of the money that is being made in real estate is not being made by investors. It's not being made by greedy, scum-sucking, bottom-dwelling landlords. If you look at the list of where all the money goes, it's going to government. And it's going to government in myriad ways. And I make a long list of, there's got to be 20 or 30 of them. But think of capital gains tax, land transfer tax. They want to do a renovation tax. They've got a vacancy tax. They've got a foreign investors tax. We've got, for small operators, we've got 50% corporate tax. So no matter how much money we make, they take 50% of that at the back end. And the government takes 20% of it at the front end in the form of property taxes. So we get hit with property taxes, and then we're going to get hit with licensing fees. And most utility companies are owned by government. Almost all water facilities are owned by government, many electric utilities. And they have no compelling reason to control their costs. So for me, it's a combination of the government constantly siphoning off most of the profit that is made in real estate of every type, combined with the very simple economics 101 logic that says if you got 3 apples in a market and 7 people want them, then the cost of those apples will be much higher than if you had 7 apples in that market and only 3 people want them. In other words, there's no housing. And if there's no housing being built, the existing housing is going to be in hot demand, and only the wealthiest people are going to be able to afford to rent or buy them.
So it sounds like what you're saying in layman's terms is that the unaffordable housing issue that we're having right now, the government is profiting from it. So then there's no incentive for them to fix the problem.
I'll say that's 85% correct, but I'll sum it up even simpler. Government cannot afford affordable housing.
Okay.
Everything that the government does, all of its revenue related to real estate is based on the value of a property. If a property has affordable rents, then the income of that property is going to be much lower. The financing as a percentage of that income is going to be much higher. So banks don't like to finance affordable housing. It's too risky for them because the amount of mortgage that they've got against the equity that's being put in is too low, and the people who are in there in the affordable housing side of things tend to be riskier than the more affluent tenants. So that compounds the whole thing. But the government, its land transfer tax, the property tax, the capital gains tax, those 3, let's say, just to keep it simple, they're all based on the value of a property. So the value of property goes down because the income goes down. If the income goes down, the net operating income goes down. And if the NOI goes down, then the assessment that's made by realtors and investors and MPAC and CRA, all these guys use the same direct capitalization method. By applying that method, the value of a property drops, so the property taxes will drop. The capital gains income will drop. The land transfer tax will drop. The government is in an impossible situation of its own making.
And this is one of the reasons why I would assume then why they haven't built any affordable housing. Like, when was the last time they even built one?
Well, I'm not sure that that's correct. There's a tremendous amount of pressure. It's not that they don't want to build affordable housing; they can't afford it. And when I say they, I mean specifically the provinces. Ontario has this year, 2021, has a $402 billion debt, the highest in Canadian history. Ontario's net debt is larger than 168 countries, including Russia. Ontario's debt is higher than Russia's debt, if you can imagine that. And it is the 20th largest debt in the world. So it simply doesn't have the money to build these things. If you look at CMHC's grand plan under the Liberal government, who said we're going to spend $40 billion over the next 10 years, which means $4 billion a year. If you take an average cost, and I think the number is probably low now, but say it's $250 a square foot. When you run the numbers at $250 a square foot into $4 billion, it comes out to just under 19,000 units. Well, that's for all of Canada. So the government is promising 19,000 units for all of Canada. It's people haven't extrapolated and worked the numbers, but it's an inconsequential amount. Ontario needs 650,000 units today just to match the average housing per capita for the rest of the country.
That's incredible.
Which is also, Canada is the lowest of all the G7 nations.
That's incredible.
So you want to ask why we have an affordable housing issue? Because the governments have not kept pace with growth, with population growth. It's that simple. I don't think there are many symptoms and causes for them not having done that. But if you want to bring it down to a root cause, it's simply because we don't have enough housing.
And you know, the thing is as well, too, is when I'm talking with new investors, we used to do a lot of investing in Durham. We've moved a lot of our business up into Peterborough market.
Okay.
When I talk to new investors now and I tell them, like, we're investing in Peterborough, they're like, yeah, but I don't know, it's so far from the city, they're like, who wants to live there? And then when they finally do purchase a property in Peterborough, they cannot believe the amount of inquiries from Facebook when they post their ad. Literally, they're overwhelmed. 300-400 people are.
Barry's the same way.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. And so how do you solve this problem, of this affordability issue? And not even just affordability, just supply.
Yeah.
There's a legitimate supply issue.
Well, I mean, I ran the numbers. I wrote a book a couple of years ago, and I ran the numbers. And 98% of all the housing that was ever built in Canada was built by the private sector. There's about 14 million homes, let's call it, yep, in Canada, and there's about 200 or 250,000 public housing rental units. So, that comes out, I think it's around 90. It's an astronomical number, over 95% anyway. So there's absolutely no way that any level of government with any amount of money will ever be able to address the housing issue. The only way that you can increase housing is to get the private sector to invest. And there are so many barriers today between the different levels of government to encourage developers to build where we most need it. The developer's saying, well, I'm going to take my $1 billion and I'm going to build in Ohio or Texas or Florida or Belize. I know about all kinds of projects in those areas. If I went to Ohio, I know a lady who bought 12 homes there at an average of $250,000 each. So it's not like housing isn't available and housing affordability isn't available. It's that certain jurisdictions and geographies have created massive disincentives to wanting the people who have the money that can solve the problem to invest. And the politicians, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but I truly believe this. All the politicians are shades of red. In other words, shades of socialism, and they're pandering to the tenant votes who are all saying, feed me, clothe me, house me. And they're ignoring the people that can actually do that.
Right.
So, take that for what it's worth. It's my personal opinion.
And that's a good point. I talked about this on one of my other podcasts where, when you get people to the polls and to get them to the polls, you don't get them to vote for you based on reality. Because what we're talking about is reality and what can be done from the investors to create more housing. You get people to the polls to vote based on dreams and what you can say to them to get them there. And then nothing happens. And I don't know if you've been paying attention, but I believe Doug Ford now supposedly has a housing task.
He put out an affordable housing task force.
Task force, that's it. Yeah, task
2 months
force.
ago. Yeah.
Have you paid any attention to that? And do you know? Yeah, what's in there, and does it even make sense? Because I haven't looked at it.
Well, that was sponsored by the government. It's not a government report. It's an independent report that the government paid for, and they brought in a group of people. And the people that they brought in all had extensive letters behind their names, right? Consultants and, big operators. None of the small operators were represented there. All right. 49% of all the housing in Canada is in the hands of unincorporated individuals. So half of the market is with pensioners and, small operators and, people who are just trying to make a living and so on. And they ignored that market completely. Now that's the dark side or the downside of that report. The upside of that report is that they made 55 recommendations and it is exceptional. I have never seen a report that's been sent to government that has so many touch points that are related to the real world. They did an excellent job of documenting all the issues that the big operators face, of which we as small operators, I would say, have 75% commonality. We have unique problems that the big guys don't have, right? They've got economies of scale and a voice, that type of thing. But even if they just did what was in that task force, municipalities are railing against it because it disempowers them. For example, one of the suggestions is that the government take away the municipality's right to approve. They can still set up their zones and say, this is where you can build and what you can build. But once that's done, municipalities should not have the right to say, oh, but we want to approve every single thing and we want 15 studies and we're going to allow NIMBYs to obliterate any plans that you've been making for 3 to 5 years. And the province is saying that is not tenable. I wrote an article about that, in fact, and said the issue of densification, which many NIMBYs are fighting against. NIMBYs, by the way, means not in my backyard, for those who might not know the term. It's basically self-interested homeowners who want to stop any large projects coming into their area. But like I say, that train left the station 15 years ago when the Places to Grow Act said, if we don't increase our density, we will not be able to afford our infrastructure. Property taxes will go through the roof for small homeowners, and they don't get that. The NIMBYs don't understand that, or if they do, they're ignoring it. Sorry, I can go on, but I'll let you get a word in here.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's great, and I think people should probably dig a little bit deeper into that.
For sure, into that report, I think it's a good one.
Yeah, for sure. But then now there's another thing that, and I think this is also too what allowed us to do this podcast is, I follow your newsletters, I read them, I think they're great, they're full of fantastic information. And now Oshawa now is trying to implement a housing license.
Yeah.
And so it looks maybe on the surface, maybe if you're a tenant that, hey, this could be a good thing, but does it help the tenants or does it help the landlords or does it hurt both?
Well, this is the first time that I've ever gotten political, even radicalized, if you will. The Oshawa's licensing program is intended to increase the staff from 28 bylaw officers to, they want to add 33 more staff. And what they want to do is, in my assessment of that program, they want to rate how bad every landlord is, create a demerit system. I think the demerit system might already be in place, or maybe they even dismantled it. I don't recall. But they want to basically rate how bad every landlord is, and then penalize the hell of them. I know stories firsthand and secondhand of people who have been fined because their grass was too tall around a fire hydrant, or they were denied a license because they couldn't replace a screen window that was made in the 1970s and they have no way to fix it. And the bylaw officer says, well, fix it, I'm not giving you a license. So now that's no longer a property standards issue. That's downright blatant extortion. Do it my way, or I will fine the hell of you and I'll destroy your livelihood. I wrote an article that came out a couple of days ago that essentially the title was Oshawa Sanctions State Surveillance and Unaccountable Bylaw Officers. And it's 100% true. And I liken it to making prisoners or convicts responsible for payment of the prison and court system that put them in prison. I mean, it's kind of a ludicrous proposition, but when the city went to, when the bylaw department went to city council and said, hey, it's going to cost $5 million, one of the councillors actually flew out of his chair and said, there's no way I am going to support the taxpayers paying $5 million. They said, go back, and the unofficial positioning, because it wasn't put in writing, but I'm 100% convinced that the message was, go back and see how you can get the landlords to pay for it.
Right.
And if that happens, this is not an Oshawa issue. Municipalities across Canada and maybe across the world look to each other for successful, in quotes, programs that raise additional revenue for the city. So Oshawa was pointing to Waterloo, Toronto, Mississauga, and saying they've done it, so we can do it too. But none of them have proposed to license all rental properties of every kind. And if Oshawa does this, I can guarantee to you within the next 5 years, all the cities will point to Oshawa and say, hey, look, they've raised millions of dollars through their, what do they call it, full cost recovery. It's the paradigm now for any time they can't raise taxes, they say, well, we're going to recover our costs because we're empowered by the province to do so. And that is going to do nothing in terms of affordability. I don't care what tax, what fee, what levy you put on to housing, it increases unaffordability. It's simple.
Because those costs get pushed onto you, the landlord, and then you, the landlord, now have to raise your rents to offset those costs, correct?
Well, I don't think there's a direct correlation there because those rents are increasing whether there's a license or not. And, normally you would say, well, whatever business costs, whatever the costs of a business are, they get passed on to the ultimate consumer. So that would be the tenant. But I don't see that being the case here so much. The consequences are much more impacting. First of all, if you take $5 million away from landlords, or you add $5 million to the housing providers' operating costs, I have a saying: $1 of NOI, or net operating income, is $20 of joy. But if you lose $1, it's oi. And you lose $20 of equity. So if you take that $5 million and divide that by a cap rate of, say, 4.5% in today's market, that's $110 million instantly wiped out in the equity of the property. So investors don't want to invest in Oshawa. Nobody would want to build in Oshawa because there's no return on investment. Why would anybody do that? From the tenant's perspective, what will happen is that all the landlords will now say, okay, well, the licensing program now established the minimum property standards, and that will become the norm. We will no longer aspire to do what we think is best for the property. We will do what the city thinks is best, and we will just meet the minimum standards. And I guarantee to you, many properties will devolve rather than evolve, or get better. From the tenant's perspective, nobody will want to build or invest in Oshawa, which means there will be more and more people. I mean, General Motors just opened up in Oshawa. All those people have come back. I think there were 2,000 people that were laid off, so I presume there's 2,000 who have come back. Where are those 2,000 people going to live if no one's building new housing? So rents are going to skyrocket. So you're going to have great property standards, compliant, unaffordable rental housing. That's going to be the net result of this program.
So that was a lot.
Sorry.
And so what are you doing then, Chris? Like, what do you...
I wrote an article.
Yeah. Are you going to continue to invest in real estate? Are you looking at different areas because of what potentially Oshawa could do? And I know what you're saying.
Well, I'm not investing in Oshawa anymore. That's a given. That's 100% given. They're absolutely at the kindest end. They're apathetic. At the most aggressive and argumentative end, they are absolutely demonizing. They demonize landlords, and they think that all landlords are slumlords. And the vast majority of us aren't, but they heap us all together, and then they want to put up this paramilitary police state to check on all of us because of the actions of a few bad actors. So I have absolutely no interest, and I pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes a year to that city.
Right.
Not doing it.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that, right? So then now somebody's listening to this. We've got all that scary stuff out of the way. And now they say, even after all of this conversation that we've had, I still want to get into real estate investing because maybe they're looking
Just not in Oshawa.
Not in Oshawa, but they realize that things are still getting unaffordable. They don't know where else to put their money because we talked about where do you put your money, right? So somebody probably doesn't want to get into a grocery store. So they still look at real estate as a great vehicle, right?
But they're still risky.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely risk in it. But how do you analyze a deal, especially in the multifamily space? Because this is where what you specialize in. And also to analyzing this, and let's answer this question too, understanding cap rates. Because you have a good understanding of it. And it's not, I don't think, what most people, when they look at a cap rate, you look at it from a different perspective. Yeah.
Well, I can't speak to that last comment. I'm not sure how other people look at it. But I've tried to make sense of it, and this idea, the word cap rate actually is an abbreviation of capitalization rate. And what you're doing is you're taking 1 year's worth of income, and you're creating a single number for that, and accountants call that capitalization. From the perspective of a layperson, you could think of it as a return on investment, and it's a little more complicated than that, but if you put your money into a bank, you're going to get, 1% return, right?
Right.
So as a buyer, you want to get as much as you can as a return. That's why you're making the investment in the first place. The seller, on the other hand, is trying to minimize the buyer's return on investment because it impacts the price at which they have to sell their property. So when you look at cap rates, you're always looking at them from the perspective of how much money will the buyer get back over a period of time. And in today's market, I would say that the 905 area code and the 705 area code are trading around 4%. If you look in Toronto, I've seen them as low as 1.5%. And the people who are buying them at 1.5% come from two groups. Either the group that doesn't know what the hell they're doing and just desperately wants to get into the market, thinking that somehow they'll appreciate the same way that houses do, and they don't. They're two entirely different things. Or they're sophisticated investors, large corporations that realize that they're going to lose money in the first 3 to 5 years and make up for it over a period of 20 years. Right? They're in it for a long-term return. So how do we look at the property? So the formula that one uses as a baseline value for determining the value of a property is called the direct capitalization method. That's what MPAC calls it.
Right.
And in essence, you look at what all these different multi-residential investment properties have been trading at, and you can usually find that out. There's all kinds of reports on the internet to tell you what the cap rates are. And you calculate the net operating income, and that takes me about 3 hours to teach in a course, so I can't do it here. But if you look at all of the income that your property makes, and you take away all of the operating expenses, that's everything except financing, taxes, and depreciation, everything else, right? And you subtract that from the total income, you're left with this amount called NOI, or NOI, net operating income.
Yep.
If you divide that NOI by the cap rate, the prevailing cap rate, that tells you where you should start in your negotiations in terms of property value. So if I took $100,000 of income from an eightplex, let's say an eightplex generates $100,000 a year. Hopefully it generates more than that, but keep the number simple. And traditionally, the expense ratio, or the total operating expenses, is probably around 40% for multi-residential. For single-family homes, it's different. I'm talking about triplexes,
right,
up, and larger. So let's say it's 40%. That means that out of the $100,000, you've got $60,000, $40,000 of expenses and $60,000 of NOI. If you divide $60,000 by 5%, again, to keep the numbers simple, what does that come out to? 1.2 million.
Something like
See if
that.
I'm right.
I'll trust you on that.
Divided by 5%. Oh, what a mind. What a mind. Yes, 1.2 million. Okay.
Okay.
So that $100,000 a year that's being generated with a $40,000 expense, trading at 5% would set a value for that eightplex at $1.2 million. And then there are many other factors that go into that. Do I have to repair that? Am I going to have to spend a lot of money because the property has been badly, looked after or neglected? Do I have tenants in there that have stayed there for 20 years and are never going to move? And there are some buildings where the whole building is filled with seniors who are never going to move. So let me take the reverse of that assessment and give you an idea of why I wouldn't buy a building filled with seniors. This is not a human rights issue. This is strictly assessing the legislation or the law of the land in Ontario and a return on investment. So I've got a senior who's been in there for, they move in today, they got one bedroom for $1,000 a month. Like you can find that, but let's say it is. And 10 years from now, 10 years from now, their rent, because of rent control, is at $1,200 a month. But the market has gone to $1,500 a month because of all the expenses. Everything is increased, and in order to make a return or a living from this property, you need to charge $1,500 a month. Well, that $300 difference may seem like a socially responsible cost of doing business, housing the seniors who have contributed to society for 50 years and now, are entitled to some discount. The problem with that is that $300 a month times 12 months is $3,600. And if you go back to my saying of $1 of noise, $20 of joy, take that, what did I say it was? 300 times 12, 3,600, and multiply by 20, or multiply by 2. That's 72,000. That one tenant at $300 a month has wiped out $72,000 in the equity of that property. And if you've got 10 seniors who will never move in that property, you've wiped out $750,000, which should probably be all the money that property will ever make in the lifetime that you hold it.
Right.
So,
and I guess to go even deeper into that as well too, that is where now you as an investor, where now you can extract some of that equity, right? To then potentially go buy another investment property, right?
Well, there's three choices. That's the first one. Improve your portfolio or retire on that money so that you're not a burden on your kids or on the state, right? You don't have to get old age security if you're making enough money. You don't need CPP if you got enough money. Or you use that money and fix up the building so that, you reinvest in it. But those are the three things that you would normally do as a small operator. That's what I did.
Right.
The first property I bought, then paid for the second one, and so on.
Now, talking about improving the property, and now I'm sure you've done this in the past with some of the investment properties you have, and the above guideline increase.
Yeah.
What's happening with that? Because that is where now you can raise the rents above the specific amount that the landlord and tenant board specifies for that year.
That's right.
Correct?
That's right. Well, the good side of that is that you can actually cover a portion of the investment that you make. The bad side of that is that the government has decided 2 years ago that they're not going to process the AGIs. They're now 4 years behind in their applications.
Really?
That is from the horse's mouth. They sent an email to me, which I sent out as one of my newsletters to everyone, saying that they're between 3 and 4 years behind. And they just had a change in senior management, and the new acting chair for the landlord and tenant board, which governs the Residential Tenancies Act, has said that she's going to focus all of her attention on tenant applications. So I wrote a letter to them and I said, maybe you're not aware, just being new in the job, but 91% of all the applications that go into the LTB are from landlords. And that means 91% of all the funding that you get comes from landlords. And you basically just slap landlords in the face and said, we don't care that we're out a year or 2 years of rent. We're still going to take care of the tenants first. That's a really nasty situation right now. Landlords are being victimized by the province, empowering tenants to, never meet their obligations, the rent obligations. And so that's the dark side. But let me answer your question about AGIs and why you should do them.
Right.
And if there are three reasons that you can apply for an application above the guideline. Again, for those of you who don't know, Ontario has a rent control regime that says the government decides how much the rent can be increased each year. And when they first started 30 years ago, it could be anywhere from 6 to 8%. Nowadays, it's between 0.7 and 2%. And they put a cap of 2.5%, which is going to enrage a lot of landlords when they discover that inflation has gone up 7%, and we're supposed to have our AGI, our guideline, annual guideline increase tracking with the consumer price index, but the government said, oh yeah, it's going to track with inflation as long as inflation doesn't go over 2.5%. We're already well over 5%.
Yeah, and that's even if you even believe that number of 7%.
Oh, it's a stupid number.
That's a whole nother can of worms.
That's another conversation.
Exactly.
So let's go back to the AGI for a moment. So there are three reasons that you can apply. One is to put in or install security that you've never had before. And that is not one-time security, like a security guard for 2 weeks, but a surveillance system typically. The second is if property taxes increase more than 50% over whatever the guideline increase was. So if your guideline for this year was 1.2, then it would be 1.2 plus half of that, 0.6. So if your property taxes went up by 1.8%, then you can apply to have that money returned to you. The problem with that, it's smoke and mirrors, because all the government does, the municipal government, is they reduce the property tax next year, and they send a letter out to every tenant saying, oh, by the way, your property tax is reduced by 1.8%, so you don't need the landlord's permission. You can just automatically deduct it from your rent. We have to wait 4 years to get our money, but the tenant gets their tax deduction 30 days, between 30 and 90 days after the city sends out one letter.
Wow.
So forget about property taxes. It's unless it's a significant amount of money, it's not worth it. And that leaves the third and most common reason for doing an AGI, or an above guideline increase, and that is for what's called capital expenses. Capital expenses are things that you spend money on that have a long life. A new roof, not repairing a parking lot, but replacing it, putting in all new windows, fixing the balconies, things like that. These are major capital expenses. And you can take all of that expense, and I just applied for one. 3 years ago, I did one for $200,000, and this year I'm doing one for $75,000. And the way it works is you submit all of the expenses that you had that qualify, and you have to give the government your rent roll and the date that the tenants moved in. Those tenants who were in the property at the time that the expenses took place must pay back a portion of that expenditure. Tenants don't realize it, but they are responsible for some of the upkeep of the building. They don't think they are. They think it's an all-inclusive rent, but it's not. In fact, most landlords think it's all-inclusive rent, and they don't know about the AGI because nobody tells them unless they take a course or, hear a podcast or, attend a seminar or something. But tenants are responsible for that, and the problem is that they then amortize the cost, the cost of that expense over the lifetime of that expense. So a roof might be 20 years, a new furnace or boiler system could be 15 years. And then they, on top of amortizing the cost over that time period, they then share it amongst all the tenants. They divide it. So if you got 25 tenants, each take 25% of, take 1/25th of that portion of the AGI, which could be 1/15th because it's 15 years. So think of, let's take $1,000. I'll do simple math. It's much more complex than this, but again, just to understand the concept. So you've got $1,000 of expenses. You amortize that over 15 years, and now you got $150 that you can recover this year. And then you amortize that or divide that by the 25 tenants into $150 is what? $2? Something like that. And you're not allowed to charge more than 3% per year for a maximum of 3 years.
Right.
So you want to talk about being reamed?
And now,
maybe
Chris,
you didn't use those words. Those are my words. So I apologize.
Right. But now this is more for multi-family investing, right? Like, I mean, if somebody's got a single family home, can they apply this, or even like
probably not
unit?
Unless they renovate the unit while the tenant's still there or the tenant moves back in, then yes, you can do it. Even for a single family home. But in most cases, it's not, the amount of time, money, and effort, the forms you got to fill out, you probably need to use a paralegal to get it done right. And they're going to cost, $1,000 to $3,000 depending. It's probably not worth it. I certainly wouldn't do it for less than, $50,000, frankly.
Right.
That's me personally, but I'm operating at a different level than a single family home.
Right, for sure. Now, there was a newsletter that you sent out last year. I didn't get a chance to dig deep into it, but there was a new tax, I believe, that came out, a speculator's tax.
Yep.
Has that been implemented?
Yeah, in Ontario, it's 15%.
Can you touch on that a little bit? So it's 15%, and this is for what, more like for flippers, for people who are buying pre-construction?
I not in that world, so I can't answer that question with any authority. I just don't know.
Right.
Sorry. That's something that you should look at. That people who are flipping, who are foreign investors. Sorry, when I said 15%, I don't know if that's a speculator's tax or a foreign investment tax. But I know that one of those two taxes, that 15% of whatever the value of the home, whatever the property is. Okay. But it could be one or the other. They've talked about so many different taxes, and it makes your head spin. They've got a renoviction tax. If you spent too much money on renovations, or if you spent a very little bit of money on a renovation, you evicted the tenant, and then you want to raise the rents, then the government wants to take a portion of that money that you made. So that's a renoviction tax. They want to tax any home that's over $1 million. They want to slap a tax on that. I don't understand how they think. Well, I do understand. I'm calling them profiteers. I'm calling the whole government profiteers, to be honest. But I don't understand why people who aren't in government would believe that by putting on a speculator's tax or a renovation tax or a home ownership over $1 million tax is somehow going to reduce the cost of something. How are you going to make it more affordable by adding taxes? If I'm a seller, all I'm going to do is, or a buyer, and later want to sell, all I'm going to do is add that cost onto my sale price. I'm going to pass through the cost to the next buyer, making it even more unaffordable than it was before.
Exactly. And what you're doing also too is you're discouraging people from buying some of these homes that have deteriorated, not in good condition, to then go in there, clean it up, and put it back into the market so that now another family can move into it and adding to the housing supply.
I'm not sure if discouraging is the right word, because as long as there's money to be made, people will spend the money. But what you're doing is you're widening the wealth gap, right? The have-nots have no chance of buying those properties, and the haves will buy those properties, renovate them, and sell them to people who have more than they have.
And you know what? You just touched on something that's really important as well, too, is this wealth gap. Yeah. And I think that is what's causing a lot of the political division right now, because a lot of people who were not political are now getting political. And that's because of the widening of this wealth gap, where you have the haves trying to hold on to what they have and the have-nots trying to take from that. And I get it. I understand it. How do you even fix this?
Well, I think the first question is you can never solve a problem until you properly identify it. Once you've identified the problem correctly, lots of people identify problems, but they don't identify them correctly, then the solutions become a little more obvious. And in the case of this wealth gap, in my opinion, my informed opinion, frankly, the wealth gap was massively increased just in the last 2 years, 100% because of government short-sighted policies, failed policies. I want to be more, I want to use stronger adjectives than that, but I have an audience. I have your, listening audience.
You can go ahead and say whatever you want, Chris, honestly.
I think they're idiots.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm fine with you saying
it's a stupid policy. What they did was it was a double-pronged, unintentional disservice to the have-nots. When they kept interest rates super low, that allowed people to borrow money left, right, and center. But at the same time, they prevented many people from being able to take advantage of that money because there isn't enough housing supply, and they didn't create incentives to create that housing supply. And they put in disincentives like the stress test and the absolutely brutal Residential Tenancies Act, the failure, injustice of the Landlord-Tenant Board. All of these other things have kept so many people away from being able to take advantage of that money. So what happened was that diminishing housing supply created massive demand, no supply, massive demand created an increase not only in housing prices, but also in rental properties as well. They've gone through the roof. And the people who own a house, and say 2 years ago, their house was, $700,000, and they had borrowed, 90% of the money. So they had a mortgage of $650,000. I don't know what the math is, but let's keep it simple, right? Sure. So they bought a house for $700,000. They got a mortgage of $650,000. They did nothing. The government went and created this massive low interest environment where people could borrow money. So everybody was out there trying to buy houses. So they created this incredible demand because the money supply was so cheap, but they didn't increase the supply. In fact, they shrunk the supply relative to the number of people who keep coming into the cities and provinces. So the supply dropped, the demand increased. There's a huge amount of money that's available, but nobody can buy anything. And what effectively happened, all the people who had those houses at $700,000 now have a house 2 years later that's worth $1.2 million. They've gone up anywhere from 25% to 100%, depending on where you live. But let's say, pick a number, 1.2 million.
Sure.
But the mortgage is still only $650,000. In fact, it's $630,000 now because they've paid off $10,000 a year. So now you've got a $1.2 million property with 50% equity instead of 10% equity because of these stupid policies that the government put together. And when your daughter, son, or even your mother, because you're affluent, mobile, upwardly mobile, young urban professional, whatever, and you want to go buy a house, you don't need to save anything. All the people that couldn't buy are trying to save $5,000, $10,000 a year, living modestly. Meanwhile, the government just gave that person with the $700,000 home $500,000 that they can borrow from the bank.
Right.
And they can go to the bank tomorrow, borrow that, and say, I'm not putting down 10%, I'm going to put down 35%. Well, who would you sell to? Either as a developer or as a home owner, you're going to sell to someone who's got, a huge down payment.
The other thing as well, too, is that now with this newfound wealth for families that have homes and this extra equity now, they are now, becoming investors. Because my phone has been ringing off the hook because of this. So where do I put this money? Where can I go to invest it? Here's the other scary part too, is that I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was talking to somebody where he's like, yeah, I just bought 5 pre-construction. So now imagine how many people are going out there and doing this. And now all of a sudden they feel like the market can never turn. Yeah. That is where now you see people get into this market speculating where they could put themselves into some serious danger and harm.
Well, there are many facets to that. I keep on being asked, are we in a bubble? Are we going to see a crash? I read stuff all the time. There's a hint that we're going to see a correction in the market. And I'm asked my opinion. And I'm not an economist, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a lawyer. But my perspective is, look back at 2008 when the whole world economy blew up. It collapsed. And the only country on the planet where the real estate values were not affected was Canada.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that we have really strong lending practices, even though our banks rape us over the coals. They're fairly well protected, and our 6 banks, national banks, are in the top 100 largest banks on the planet. And I'm sure if we put all 6 of our banks together, they'd probably be the single largest bank on the planet. So what did happen back then, though, was that listings dropped to nothing. Inventory dropped to nothing, just like it is now, right? There's no inventory. And realtors got royally, stuck because nobody was selling, so you couldn't buy anything. But the prices didn't drop 30%. In the States, properties dropped by 50%. It would have been a phenomenal time to buy properties in 2008. I only started in 2009, so I missed that window. And I didn't buy my first property until 2011. It took me 2 years to feel confident enough to invest my life savings, right? And I went and bought an 11-plex. I didn't buy a house. I went straight for the deep end.
Right. Sink or swim.
Yeah. Well, I was committed to the process, and whether I own 2 units or 12 units, it's going to be the same thing, in my opinion. The one reason I bought the multiplex is because if I have a vacancy, I don't have 100% vacancy, right?
Right.
If I buy a 10-plex, I've got 10% vacancy, and that's for if it's empty for a whole year, and it wouldn't be. But if I have a house and it's empty, I'm still paying a mortgage regardless of whether or not any money's coming in.
Correct.
So on a 10-plex, about 7.5 units cover all of your costs. Right. So if you can have a vacant unit for a year, and you may not make a lot of money, but you're not going to go the other direction. But to come back to your point now, I don't think we're going to see a massive correction or a drop, because I do not have any confidence in anything that any level of government is doing, that any party has said that they're going to do, that gives me any confidence that they're going to fix the housing availability crisis. They're not going to fix it.
Right.
We're going to look at 3-4 years from now. It's been 6 years since the Liberal government said we're spending $40 billion, and the problem has exacerbated. It's grown.
It almost feels that they've painted themselves into a corner. Like the interest rates should be higher based on what's happening with inflation, but they can't. They couldn't take interest rates up to 7-8%. They could, but it'll destroy the economy.
Well, that's the danger now. And that was the second half of the answer to your question about the people. That person that just bought 5 homes, unless pre-construction homes, unless he put down 50% on each one of those homes, so he's got equity in there to absorb the interest that's going to be inevitably increased, he could find himself negatively cash flowing, and he could get wiped out. So let me do a simple math example for you.
Well, that's not even that he even wants to cash flow. He just wants to flip these things, most likely. Well,
and now there's an anti-flipping legislation that the NDP and Liberal government together in their coalition, they made a deal a week ago that said, we're going to help the NDP get some of their projects through as long as they can guarantee that we'll be a minority government until 2025. So, devil, I don't know what the right word is, a deal with the devil. Maybe that's too harsh. I know I've just offended some people, but
yeah. I hear you. It's going to be an interesting 3 years.
Well, one of the outcomes of that is that they wanted to put in this program to stop flipping. They also want to spend billions on a dental plan. I don't know where that money is coming from. I think it's great that we have a dental plan, but I don't know who's paying for it when we already have a $400 billion debt.
But back to you just print it.
Oh, just print it, yeah. So what will happen then is that the world will lose confidence in our currency, and we'll be paying 100,000 Canadian dollars for a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting a little bit flippant there. So I'll backtrack. But so that guy who's bought those 5 homes, if he's banking on the money being available a year from now, let me take a simple example. So last year, I got a phenomenal refinancing on a 21-unit property I own. And I got 1.67%, which is amazing. I mean, think about it, even today, it's almost 3%, right? You can do a bit better with the commercial property, not a lot, but a bit better. But let's say that you bought your pre-construction project at 2%. 5 years from now, and I do believe this is going to happen, interest rates are at 4%. I don't think they can increase them rapidly, and you'll see, from this math, you'll see why. So, but over a period of 5 years, it went from 2% to 4%. Well, in that property I just talked about, I pay $11,000 a month in interest at 2%. 4 years from now, when I go to refinance, I will have paid down some of that loan, but it's not going to be consequential. And I now have to pay 4% interest. So instead of paying $11,000 a month, I now have to pay $22,000 a month. I guarantee to you that there is nothing that I could do under rent control that would prepare me to be able to double my income in order to be able to pay off that doubling in the financing, which is another reason why you should invest in banks. Okay, so if that interest rate doubles, anyone that had low interest financing in the heady days that we've enjoyed in the last decade are going to get massacred. And if they raise the interest rates too quickly, it won't be the big guys that are they're going to take a hit, but they're not going to disappear. But the bottom 25%, all of us small guys, the guys that are flippers, the pensioners who bought a property so that they can retire, and so on, these guys are going to be catastrophically wiped out.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If you buy a new property, it won't be a problem because you'll just rationalize that 4%. But if you're refinancing, you're going to get killed.
Yeah, and this is where you really have to start, if you're going to invest, using fundamentals, right?
Yes.
Analyzing properties correctly and not just hoping that this market is going to continue to keep going up. Look, I don't have a crystal ball.
No, if you want to hope, put your money on a roulette table.
Yeah.
Because that's the same game you're playing.
Right.
Right? If you don't understand those fundamentals, how do you protect yourself from what I just told you is going to happen? Well, while everybody else is borrowing money because it's so cheap, I've been paying off my mortgages, so I have at least a 50% equity in every property I own, so that when those mortgage interest rates do rise, the equity will absorb a lot of that shock. I'll be hurt by it, but I won't be. I won't. They won't negatively cash flow, and I won't lose those properties. I won't have to, power a sale.
And you know what? And that is good advice. Especially in this type of a climate, that if you have multiple properties, you may want to consider taking a look at what you have. How do you pay some of that down? Or maybe you sell one of those properties.
Exactly. Sell one property to pay down the others.
Exactly.
And the safe number is 50%, but you could probably get away with, 35% equity.
Yeah. And that's what
I wouldn't hold less than 35% though. I think you'd be putting yourself at risk. But this again is advice for people who are cautious investors, let's say, small, up to medium risk. High risk are always going to take, roll the dice.
Right.
But for the cautious investor or the retiree, the pensioner, and so on, that's my advice. Pay down some of your mortgage while you can.
Yeah. And listen, and I'm not saying, and I don't think we're saying to say, don't get into real estate investing, don't leverage. You can leverage, because when you're starting off, you have to leverage.
Yeah, no question.
Just use fundamentals. Get into it. And
correct.
Attend one of your classes, attend one of my classes. Just understand how to do it properly, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it doesn't mean that your money has to be there forever. Once things stabilize and you can see some stability in the economy and so on, then take the money out and go look for your properties. Of course, everybody else is doing it as well. So you're competing against more people, but at least you're doing it in a safer environment.
Exactly. Chris, this is a great conversation.
Well,
we are well over an hour now.
Oh, okay. I have no idea. I just figured you're watching the clock. I
was, and then I lost track of it. But it goes to show that I enjoy having these conversations with you. You bring a different insight, and you have a fair assessment of what's happening, and you tell the truth from your perspective, and that's what I want.
Well, I get in trouble for doing that sometimes, but I'm not going to change. I'm too old.
And I don't think you should. And that's why I have you here today. So I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. If people want to learn more about you, and maybe even take a look at one of your courses and attend it, how can they do that?
I guess the easiest way is just go to the website, www.aztech, AZTECH, Realty, REALTY.com. There's a whole bunch of articles there. There's other podcasts. Gary has said that he'll let me post this podcast on that website as well, so you can find it there, if not here. And my books, the course, and other things I've done. There's a lot of free stuff there you can learn about as well.
Beautiful. Chris, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, stay safe.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.